Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. We're going to start. It's already 12, and I want to welcome you to our Canoe webinar, expert webinar. My name is Marie-Claude Allard, and I'm the communications specialist for Canoe. Before we get started, I would like to remind you to turn off your camera and stay on mute during the webinar. If you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat. We will have time to answer them at the end of the webinar. Also, this presentation will be recorded and sent to all registered participants after the webinar. It's my pleasure to now introduce Carly Zeter. Carly is an associate professor at Concordia University at the Department of Biology, also University Research Chair in Urban Ecology and Sustainability. Her research seeks to understand the provision of ecosystem services in human-dominated landscapes. Through her research, Carly aims to learn how we can better manage the places we live, work, and play to provide the benefits we need while reducing environmental problems and conserving biodiversity. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Zeter for today's expert webinar entitled, Why is Urban Biodiversity Essential for Wellbeing?
Okay, thank you very much, Merci. It's a pleasure to be here today. Just to confirm, you're seeing my slides right now? Perfect, great. Okay, so I am going to talk to you today about why urban biodiversity is essential for well-being, which is a huge topic. So we're gonna just like scratch the surface of this today, but hopefully I can share some good examples. We can have a good conversation about some of these areas. And so I have been fascinated by nature for a really long time, going back to playing in the mud as a child to, being a brand new grad student, studying trees through to my job today, where I'm incredibly lucky that I still get to spend a lot of my time, playing in the mud, learning about nature, teaching others about nature. And one of my very favorite places to learn about nature is right here in the city. This is maybe a little unique among ecologists. I think a lot of ecologists get into this field because they want to go, out into what I sometimes call big nature. They want to be out in the mountains and the forests and the pristine lakes. And I want to be like in your backyard, figuring out what is really going on super close to home. And so I'm really fortunate that I get to spend my time doing just that. Here at Concordia, I run an urban landscape ecology lab full of all of these, amazing, young and creative people who help us think about a couple of big research questions. And with my lab, we think a lot about what I sometimes call ecological infrastructure or like the ecological fabric of a city. Basically, all the little bits and pieces of green and blue that are interwoven through our cities, everything from, big parks to backyards to street trees to vacant lots. And we ask, how can we better understand and manage these spaces both to support other species, to support our non-human neighbors, but also to influence our health and well-being. How do we manage this nature so that it works for us? We do that in lots of different ways. So we use sensors and fieldwork and satellite data and bicycles to understand air temperature mitigation by the urban forest. We use a lot of community or citizen science to try and understand the species we share our cities with. What are the birds and bees and trees that are surrounding us in our everyday lives? And we do a lot of more kind of traditional conservation biology where we look at species like birds or bees in our urban green spaces and we see, how are they doing? How can we better support them? Today, I am going to really zoom out from my own research, although I'll sneak in a few student examples here and there. But I'm going to zoom out and talk more generally about urban biodiversity. So what do we know about the species we share our cities with? Cities are not the kind of biodiversity deserts that I think we once thought that they were. Uh, we're going to move into what does this mean for us? as people who live in these cities, most Canadians, 8 out of 10 of us, live in a city. That means cities are where we experience nature most often. And then at the end, we'll do a little bit of what can we do? Both what can, we as in the city do, but also, what can you do as a listener of this webinar? And I'm going to back way up here so that we're all on the same page and just think about what biodiversity is. I think we use a lot of kind of shorthands. When we talk about biodiversity, we often just mean like nature or green in general. But when scientists are talking about or are measuring biodiversity, what we're really trying to do is capture something about variability, about variety, whether that's variety of species, whether it's variety in different types of habitats, different genes. Biodiversity is all about differences. Now, I want you to pause for a minute. I've been teaching intro bio all morning, so I'm going to put my teacher hat back on, and I'm going to do a little class participation. And I want you to picture, if I say biodiversity, what do you picture? What's the place that your brain goes to, or what do you imagine as something that is really biodiverse? And pop an answer in the chat if you're thinking of, it could be an actual real place, it could just be a type of ecosystem. But what do we think about? All right, I'm getting rainforest, I'm getting soil, oh, I'm getting Gary Oak ecosystem, garden, rainforest, the Amazon, islands. We definitely have some gardeners in the group today, which is great. My very first summer field job as an ecologist was in the Gary Oak ecosystem. So I have a soft spot for those systems as well. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of forest, a lot of rainforest. And when I ask my students this, I get those kinds of answers too. People say, okay, I picture, the mountains, or I picture a tropical rainforest, a coral reef, African savanna, things that we think of as really wild and wonderful and that we see on like planet Earth and that David Attenborough talks about. But you can tell that we're on an urban webinar because a lot of you are also saying my garden or my backyard. And well, these nice pictures here are certainly biodiverse parts of the world. Our cities are incredibly biodiverse too, including our gardens. We just need to learn how to look for that diversity in a little bit of a different way. Um, and I would argue that right now, we are in kind of like a golden age for urban biodiversity. Everyone's into urban nature, which is great for me who studies urban nature. Um, but if you were to look, at my bookshelf at home, you'd see all of these books, Nature's Best Hope, Unseen City, Field Notes from a Hidden City, that are about urban biodiversity, about the species that share our cities. And these are not textbooks, they're not scientific books. These are popular books talking about species we share our cities with, which shows me that there's this real appetite for understanding biodiversity in cities. We see this also in articles that are showing up on the news, showing up in the journals we read. This piece in the Revelator by Sarah Gagne, I just read recently, and I really appreciated on urban areas brimming with biodiversity. This piece from a few years ago, Cities Aren't the Wildlife Deserts Scientists Once Feared, another great read. And so we're becoming more aware that there is a lot of biodiversity in our cities, and that awareness is great. And so what do we know about who's sharing our cities with us? If we look at, the science, we look at what we're studying, what's happening in our cities, and what are cities doing to try and foster or support this biodiversity. I'm going to just pull a couple examples. I'm not going to do a comprehensive sweep of, urban biodiversity today because I want to get to some of the health parts. But some of the most comprehensive work we have on urban biodiversity at a global level comes from Mila Aronson and colleagues. This paper is about a decade old now, but it's still one of the most kind of comprehensive reads on just what do we know kind of generally. We know a lot about plants and birds. Those are things that we really like to measure in cities. And if we look at this article where they went to over 100 cities, and they looked at, how many birds, how many plants do we see? They found over 2,000 bird species. That's about 20% of, total avian diversity we can find in a city somewhere, and over 14,000 plant species. This is not just common birds and plants. We also see in this paper that there are, one of my headphones just died. So if you can't hear me anymore, put it in the chat, but I think it's still working. So this also includes 36 bird and 65 plant species that are threatened with global extinction. So we can protect, rare, endangered species in cities as well. If we, zoom in on Canada here, there's a great recent article in the Canadian Geographic on birds, and I loved this quote from Kevin Fraser. As a professional ornithologist, it's surprising even to me how many species I can spot from my home office window in the middle of urban Winnipeg. So we see a lot of bird species in our cities, and this is one of the things that cities are acting on, are actively kind of trying to support. Arguably, I think sometimes we could be doing a better job of this, but in general, we do see, we see certifications for bird-friendly cities. We see design guides for bird-friendly buildings. How do we prevent window collisions? There is a lot that we know that we can do to support birds in our cities. We also see a lot of pollinators in our cities. Cities can be pollinator hotspots, particularly for bees, for wild bees. Just to pull a couple of examples that I'm familiar with, we have over 170 wild bee species here in Montreal. These are some beautiful photos that one of my students took of some of our wild bee species. We have over 350 wild bee species in Toronto. Toronto actually has a city bee. It's this little green sweat bee up here, which I think is amazing. And again, this is a group that we're, actively trying to support, to embrace, to protect in our cities. We see, increasingly pollinator protection strategies and kind of actions that we can take. And we have abundant plant life in cities. We actually tend to have more species of plants in cities than the areas surrounding them because people love plants. We love to bring plants in, plant them, introduce them to our homes and gardens. We have an incredibly diverse urban forest in many cities, diverse in terms of the number of species. We're going to come back to this a little bit later. So this is an example from one of my students, former students, Kaylee Hutt-Taylor, who did a neighborhood tree inventory where she had residents submit, what are the trees you find on your own property? She looked at streets and parks and schools. And she found just in one Montreal neighborhood, we had more than 150 tree species. And 30% of those were only found on private land. So this graph, the way you can think about this is, as you go out and you look at a tree and you identify the species, at first, every time you look at a tree, it's there's a good chance it's something different. So you're getting more species, more species, more species. Eventually, you start to find the same things. You kind of found all the species, and this curve is going to level off. And that's what we see when we look at streets and parks and institutions. But when we look at people's backyards, that line just kind of keeps going up. We just keep finding new species, new species, new species. And so we have this incredible diversity. What this example shows to me is the contribution that our homes and our gardens are often making to urban biodiversity. This is often one of the largest types of green space in a city. It's just chopped up into lots of different pieces, so we don't always think of it that way. Again, this is something cities are really actively trying to foster and support, urban forestry. I've been using a lot of Toronto, Vancouver, big city examples. So I'll go to my hometown of Windsor, where they're now launching their first urban forest management plan. And again, this is a common way that we support urban biodiversity. Now, I was just picking a few examples. I could go on. Every year, there's a city nature challenge where people go out with, iNaturalists and try and identify species. And last year, people from almost 500 cities participated, made almost 2 million observations of different species. I haven't even touched on the incredible diversity of things like fungi and microbes and all the little creatures that are, undoubtedly affecting our lives and health in all kinds of ways in cities. So we are sharing our cities with a lot of other creatures. And I think over the last few years, COVID-19 really brought that local biodiversity into focus. And I talked about how we're in a little bit of a golden age of paying attention to urban biodiversity. And I think a lot of this started with people paying closer attention to the nature that's really been at our doorsteps all along. So when our cities got a little quieter, we started noticing the wildlife that's sharing these spaces, and we saw this over and over, more urban wildlife sightings during coronavirus. Quieter ocean is a boon to orcas. It's a boost for bees and rare wildflowers. Um, so we're paying attention to the biodiversity that's around us. But this time was also a reminder of the many benefits that urban nature brings us. We often talk about these in terms of ecosystem services or nature's benefits or natural capital, where we get things like food and medicines and blood protection and mental health improvement from the biodiversity surrounding us in our cities. And again, over the last few years, we've seen increasing attention paid to this. And so if we look at, for example, I'm just going to show like a handful of news articles that I kind of held onto that spoke to me about this. And we see, we're getting people who have never grown their own food asking what's the simplest way to start. Lots of people are starting to grow their own food, starting to garden, starting to engage directly with their local nature. I often ask my first year biodiversity ecology students, it's a class of about 200, and I say, how many of you have grown a plant from seed? And I would say, every year that number goes up and up and up. People are really into engaging directly with nature. Urban green spaces function as the primary source of natural recreation for about half of New Yorkers. More city dwellers during COVID, confined to their homes, are appreciating that. But it has always been true that for many city dwellers, urban green spaces are their primary way that they engage with nature, engage with biodiversity. For many people, it's the only way that they engage with nature. People are not necessarily leaving the city to go camping, to go hiking, to go view natural areas. We are getting nature where we live. And I think we all kind of intuitively understand the importance of nature and green spaces and parks for mental health, for exercise. Our physical and our mental health is really improved by being able to spend time in green spaces. And this is something that the research, the peer-reviewed science is just getting stronger and stronger and more numerous. This idea that green spaces keep us healthy. We see, articles. I've just pulled two articles quickly here, but I could pull, 24 that show green space, a systematic review that shows, green spaces reduce mortality. People who live near green spaces are less likely to die early. People who grow up surrounded by more green space have a lower risk of mental health issues later in life. And these associations, they persist even when we think about socioeconomics, even when we think about your family history, even when we think about all these other factors that we know affect our health. Green spaces still tend to have an effect. We also know that urban green spaces, and particularly trees, are really important for our physical health and safety. Urban forests help us beat the heat. This is a graph from a study that I did several years ago, and something we do a lot of research on in the lab is, as we see higher levels of tree cover, we can see dramatically cooler temperatures on hot summer days. And that doesn't just, like feel nice. That's also a really like a life-saving benefit in many parts of the world. And so we're seeing, articles in things like The Lancet, in, the health literature done by health researchers that are taking into account trees and green spaces. So this just pulling a quote from this article where they estimated the health impact of a canopy goal in a particular city. And they found, this was in Philadelphia, they found 400 premature deaths, including almost 250 premature deaths in areas of lower socioeconomic status, so disproportionately in marginalized populations, would be prevented annually by meeting those canopy cover goals. And moving beyond that, we see articles talking about the role of medical professionals, of medical schools, of medical training in advocating for the expansion of green space because of these really strong relationships with human health and wellness. Um, and of course, this is particularly urgent in a changing climate. If you go to, this is the Climate Atlas of Canada, which is an excellent resource on climate change in general, but also in Canadian cities. We can see how quickly conditions are changing. If we look at Montreal, where I'm speaking to you from today, when I was a child, Montreal would have about 8 days, like 1 week of the summer, over 30 degrees. And by the time I retire, we'll have 50 days of the summer over 30 degrees. There is a real need for strategies that can help to combat these changes, to help us adapt to these changes that we know are coming. And trees and nature are one strategy. There's lots of other things we need too. It's, a whole portfolio of approaches when it comes to things like climate change. But again, this is an area where cities know this. Cities are working on this. Pulling a quote from the Montreal Climate Action Plan, mature tree absorbs rainwater, filters the air, reduces noise, da, 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 da. Increasing the number of trees in Montreal is one of the most significant actions to better adapt to climate hazards. So green space, the research, I would say the research on this is very clear that urban green space is critical infrastructure for health and well-being. I could give you, dozens more examples of this. But the take home point is that we often think of urban greening as it's like nice to have. Like it's nice if we have more green space, but it's not critical the way, our roads and our bridges and our homes are. And I think that's the wrong mentality. We need to start seeing urban green space as the critical infrastructure it is when it comes to well-being in our cities. And this is particularly important because we know that that critical green infrastructure is not distributed equally in our cities today. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on inequity today, although we certainly can talk about it afterwards in the questions. But there are a ton of resources from Canoe on this. We can look at the Healthy Plan City and explore equity. I just pulled, a quick screenshot from Ottawa in this case, but we can see in city after city after city that trees and green spaces are not distributed equally, where wealthier and whiter communities have more access to nature and thus more access to these benefits. Now, I've just spent 20 minutes talking about how green space is really good for health, which is something I think a lot of you probably know. But I said I was going to talk about biodiversity. And remember, when I introduced biodiversity, I talked about it as variety, variability, different things. And so, do we need biodiversity for health, or do we just need green or blue? I didn't really talk about blue space. I'm a terrestrial girl, but is like any kind of green or blue space going to do, or do we need biodiversity? Do we need variety? Right away, I think we can recognize that the type of green space matters. The health benefits we get from, gardening, for example, might be different than we get from trees. So like a type of green space, having a forest versus a lawn versus a wetland, having diversity of those green space types, we're going to get a diversity of benefits. But even within a given green space, even if we're talking about, a park or a garden, the types of organisms, the variety of organisms may matter as well. And this intersection between biodiversity and well-being or natural benefits is still a really active area of research. We're still pulling on a lot of these threads. But I'm going to present just a couple examples that I hope will convince you that biodiversity is at least worth considering. And so we really do a disservice in a lot of research by reducing all of this amazing variety and data and difference down to NDVI, or just a measure of greenness, which historically are the kinds of metrics we often reach for in health studies, in epidemiology studies. We look at, okay, how green is something? Does that correlate? But that can really hide a lot of relationships. So another way of thinking of this is like the quality of the green space, the kinds of features it has, the kinds of species it has, might really matter. And so, okay, I don't know why we're getting something showing up first, but ignore those green bars for now for a minute. Um, so does biodiversity give us more benefits in cities? What does like the science say about this? Um, yes, but then in like true ecological pattern, it kind of depends. So this figure I'm showing you is a study I did several years ago. So it's a little out of date, but I think the point still stands. And what I did here is I looked at a bunch of different assessments, different peer-reviewed scientific papers that measured both some kind of ecosystem service or benefit and some kind of biodiversity in a city and compared those two things. And I wanted to know, like, if you get more biodiversity on, some metric, you have more species, you have more functional diversity, do you get more of that benefit that they're looking at? And yes, sometimes. So this bar here, this second bar, shows studies that found a positive relationship, more diversity, more benefit. Occasionally it was negative. Often, almost as often as it was positive, it didn't really matter. It didn't significantly change one way or the other. Sometimes studies just make assumptions. They just say, oh, there's more biodiversity, so there must be more benefit without actually testing it. That's this bar here. But what we find most often, this really big bar, that's the it depends bar. So that's, the service provision, the amount of carbon storage, the amount of flood regulation, the amount of pollination. It depends on who's there. It depends on the composition. So it's not necessarily that like more species gives you more of something, but certain species, certain functional groups, certain structures. So we have a long way to go to fully understanding these relationships. But to really understand the well-being benefits of nature, we do need to know something about the quality of that nature. Now, this figure is almost a decade old, so I'm going to show some more recent examples as well, because this science has really taken off in the last few years. And I want to show you some emerging research on the biodiversity health relationship in particular. And I'm going to start with mental health. And this is a European study that I find pretty amazing, pretty powerful. And what they did is they looked at birds and the number of species of birds that you could hear and what that meant for people's happiness. And what we see here is a proportional increase in either bird species richness or household income, and then an increase in kind of life satisfaction. And in blue, we're talking about money. Generally, up to a certain point, you give people more money, they tend to have more life satisfaction. But you know what gives you more life satisfaction? A steeper slope, a stronger increase in life satisfaction than money? Hearing a lot of species of birds, which is amazing, right? And this was not just like more birds or louder birds. It was specifically biodiversity, more variety, more different bird songs gave people this amazing boost in life satisfaction. There have been similar studies. This is a study from my friend and colleague, Rachel Buxton, here in Ottawa. She published a study just last year in Canadian cities specifically, where they looked at tree species and bird species and how that was associated with people's like self-reported mental health. The different colors, you don't have to think too much about that. Those are just different models. So as they include, more socioeconomic variables or more kind of background health variables, as they take into account more things, what happens to the relationship. And what we see, no matter how many things they start taking into account, we still see this positive slope. We still see that as we get more species, we get a higher proportion of people saying they have better mental health. And so we get this positive relationship. They also looked at things like distance to green and blue spaces, and those were less important. It wasn't just being around green space or blue space, it was actually having more biodiversity, having more species, having kind of a richer environment. And particularly, they looked at kind of different measures of mental health. And one of the things they looked at was was stress. And they didn't really find a strong association there. So being around more species didn't necessarily reduce your stress, but it still reduced people's reports of mental health. And so it might be that they hypothesize that this is because of an increase in like positive emotion or happiness or fascination. Biodiverse environments might be helping us to like cope with stress and find more enjoyment even if we're stressed. Something that I think is really important to note here is what I see as a kind of still a gap or still a really emerging area in this field is that like the kind of biodiversity probably really matters. We focus a lot on species richness because that's one of the easier things to measure. We just count the number of species. But often that's not what's actually important. And so this study from my colleague Rose Graves, they actually went out and they showed people images that they had manipulated of wildflowers. And they changed different things about this. So they would show people pictures that have, maybe the same number of species, but some of them were more evenly distributed. So you had like an equal number of each species, or the same number of species, but one picture was more colorful or, had more flowers. And in general, when people said, like, what did they like? What were their aesthetic preferences? What made them feel good? It wasn't the pictures with the most species. It was the picture with the most flowers, with the most diversity of colors. And so biodiversity still mattered. It still really influenced how we felt about a space, but it wasn't necessarily species richness. So if we're only measuring the number of species, we might miss like the real relationships that are happening here. So we need a lot more collaborative work with, biodiversity scientists and health scientists and social scientists who can start kind of pulling out some of this nuance about which qualities in an environment are most important. There's also still a lot we just don't know about biodiversity and health. So my colleague Rita and others here in Quebec led this great paper on pollen. And so pollen, of course, is an allergen and affects our physical health. Many of you probably have pollen allergies, but we don't really know a lot about how specific species, in this case of trees, affect people's allergies. So what Rita and her colleagues did, they took a map of all the trees in Montreal, all the species, and this is a map of the like allergenicity level. How much do those tree species trigger allergies? Red means it's really high, orange, yellow is kind of moderate, green is low. And the only difference between these maps is the database they used. So certain databases will say, oh, based on this study, we think this species is really bad for pollen allergies. And another will be like, no, that species is not that bad. So we just don't have good knowledge yet. So depending where we pull our data from, we can get a really different picture of what's going on for our health. So we need more science actually digging into specific health effects of certain species. But what this paper also shows, I'm just going to zoom in on, one of these. This is estimates from pollen.com. I'm going to zoom in on one of these because I want you to be able to see this little square here where you can actually see like the individual trees. So what looks like kind of just a yellow blob is actually some trees that are bad for allergies, some that are okay, some that are really good. And so what the researchers hypothesize is that by increasing the diversity and particularly the evenness, the like relative abundances of different species, will reduce allergies overall. Like in this knowledge gap, in the absence of knowing enough to be able to plant, exactly the right trees for allergies, if we just focus on diversity, the greater the diversity of species and the evenness among them, the less likely we are to plant, a bunch of concentrated, really bad pollen trees. So focusing on diversity can be a good way, while we're still waiting for more evidence to try and promote healthy landscapes. Those are some really kind of specific studies and their findings. I also want to talk a little bit more generally about why I think we need diversity. And one of the reasons, which pretty straightforward when you think about it, we need diversity to provide multiple benefits across the landscape. Different kinds of organisms give us different benefits, whether those are different species or just different traits within species. And so I study trees, and I get asked all the time. I get asked by reporters, by my neighbors, by my hairdresser, what's the best tree? I want to plant the best tree. Which tree should I plant? And I really don't like answering that question. I actually refuse to answer it like on the radio. And the reason I don't like answering it is that there isn't a best tree. The kind of tree you plant depends on what you want. If you want a really nice tall shade tree, maybe you want a big stately elm. If you want a tree that's going to attract bees or birds or that gives you beautiful flowers, maybe you want a serviceberry. Um, that's the tree I have in my yard because my husband is from Saskatoon and this tree reminds him of home, right? There's a lot of reasons we might make a certain choice. And so, what do we want? Sometimes these goals conflict. There is not one best tree for all of our well being needs. And the other thing is that if we want, a little bit of everything across the landscape, across the neighborhood, then we need variety. We need diversity in trees. So often when people say, what's the best tree? I say, look around, think about the species you see a lot, and then choose something else. That's your best tree. And if we go back to that kind of neighborhood tree data set I presented earlier, back at the beginning, my student that went out and measured trees in NDG in Montreal. And this is an ordination. If you don't know anything about ordinations, what you are looking at, what you want to look for is clusters. And so each of these little dots is one site. It's like one backyard or one block of a street or one piece of a park that we went out and we looked at all the tree species. And then we looked at all the different traits they had. Were they tall? Did they grow fast or slow? Did they have nice fall colors? What kind of shape were they? All the things that influence the benefits we get from them. And what we find, even though there were a lot of different species, on streets, for example, remember, we're looking for clustering. Clustering means things are more similar. So this purple cluster is street trees. From block to block to block to block, even though there were different species, those species are all kind of doing the same thing. They're all like tall and have nice fall colors and fill a very particular role in the environment. So they give us benefits, but they give us very similar benefits. If we go over here in blue, this big blue cluster, that's people's yards. And people's backyards are doing a little bit of everything. So yard to yard to yard, the trees are really different because they depend on what we've chosen and what we want. And so this is another way that diversity, in this case, a diversity of land use types, a diversity in governance and people making decisions can promote a diversity of benefits that we get, in this case, from trees. The last one I'm going to talk about, which is, maybe one of the most important, is that biodiversity provides resilience. So we talk a lot about, the benefits of green space. We have lots of studies showing how important trees and green spaces are. And sometimes it really does just need to be green. We just need enough green or enough trees, and the biodiversity might not matter like at one point in time. This is a really nice looking street. I would love to live on this street. It looks like it provides lots of benefits. There's lots of shade. Those trees are taking up lots of water to reduce flooding, for example. Those trees are probably providing a home for a lot of animals. Even though they're not really diverse, these are all the same species. They're providing a lot of what we need to live well and healthy in that area. But this is what that exact same block looked like 3 years later. This is in Ohio, but it could be in Montreal, it could be in Ottawa, it could be in Toronto. And this is because these trees were all ash trees, which are all susceptible to emerald ash borer. And so within a very short span of time, we went from an area providing, incredible life-saving health benefits to an area that is providing much fewer benefits. And that might actually be negative, for our mental health, going out and seeing all of these dead trees. And so diversity provides resilience. Diversity allows us to keep our benefits in an uncertain future. And the reason this is really important is that, even though our urban forests are often really diverse in terms of just like the total number of species, those species aren't well balanced. So if we look again, I'm going to pick on Montreal because it's where I live and where I know the data best. We can see this is from before emerald ash borer was a big issue about a decade ago. And we can see here the most common species in each burrow. And you can see that they repeat. There's only a few species that are ever the most common. And if we were to add up, even though we have hundreds of tree species in Montreal, if we were to take just the top five, that would make up more than 50% of the public trees. So most of our trees are actually really similar to each other, similar species. Imagine, a pest comes through that targets maples. All of a sudden, all of these blue and red areas are losing their trees and losing those benefits. And this, unfortunately, we really like things that are uniform. We really like to plan and design and plant, rows of the same thing. We see this over and over in our city building and our city design. Um, and that like visual preference for uniformity really goes against this very practical need for species diversity to maintain benefits on the landscape. So what can we do? How can cities protect and enhance urban biodiversity? I'm going to talk through kind of three things quickly. Um, First, I think we have to really start thinking about how to balance greening and density because we want denser cities for all kinds of good sustainability reasons. But as your city gets dense, it's harder for it to be green. We're going to increase the quality of what we have and monitor our progress. So if we start with density, dense and green is possible if we work at it. So there's a great recent article from Rob McDonald. And in general, what we see as we get more dense, as our population goes up, our tree cover goes down. But there are bright spots. So bright spots being like areas, neighborhoods that have more green space given their density than we would expect. So these are areas that have like 3 times the average for that level of density. And we can see that here. We can see that even in low density neighborhoods, we don't always have a lot of green space. And we can have quite high density neighborhoods that are still very green. And the way that we hit these bright spots is one, shrinking the footprint of the built up area. So thinking about what types of housing are we prioritizing? What types of transit are we prioritizing? Housing, a large single family home is going to have a much bigger footprint for the same number of people as, missing middle duplexes, triplexes, or an apartment building. Transit, a huge proportion of our cities goes to cars. If we think about moving people by cars, the amount of space it takes compared to buses or trams or other forms of active transportation is just incredible. If we can shift towards more equal sharing of our space between people and cars, we create so much more space for greening, so much more space for biodiversity at the same levels of density in terms of the number of people that can live there. And the other way we can get these bright spots is sharing space between nature and development. So in my lab, we often call this greening the gray. So strategies like green roofs or green laneways or really well-engineered soil cells that allow trees to grow in dense spaces, ways we can get green kind of on top of our built infrastructure. The next thing I think cities can do for biodiversity is increasing the quality of what we have. So a green space is not a green space is not a green space, right? Green spaces with more biodiversity are going to provide more benefits. And we see this happening. So this is an example from my neighborhood where there is an effort to put in a biodiversity corridor. This is in the Sud-Ouest in Montreal, where groups of landscape architects and designers are working to install these kind of biodiversity islands of flowering plants and shrubs that they've designed to look aesthetic, but also try and maximize biodiversity. So taking land that's already green, that's already set aside and protected, as a park, and then just amping up the biodiversity benefits. This is a public example, but we can also think about private land, which makes up a huge portion of our urban green space. So can we do more in our own yards to improve biodiversity? My office lights like to go out if I don't move enough. I love Douglas Tallamy, who wrote the book Nature's Best Hope that I showed briefly at the beginning, has this idea that he calls homegrown national park. And he talks about, if everyone just dedicated a little bit of their lawn to native plants, you just took, half your lawn and turned it into a garden, the combined area would be, bigger than our largest national parks in terms of what we could do for biodiversity. And the last piece here that I think cities really need to do if they want to improve their biodiversity, they have to monitor their progress. It's really hard to know if you're improving if you don't know what your baseline is. And so actually going out, monitoring how you're doing is really critical. And I'm saying this like it's a small or a trivial thing, and it's not. It's really hard because biodiversity can mean so many different things. There's so many different ways to measure it. And this is where I think working with scientists, having more, scientists, municipality partnerships can be really powerful. This is just a picture of some of my students who launched a community science project to go out and monitor that biodiversity corridor to actually see what species are there and are using it. And we're going to go back and do it again. So executing these approaches well is going to require interdisciplinary collaboration. So we need, ecologists working with planners and developers. We need health scientists talking to ecologists, talking to architects. We need different allied fields who all think about the city to come together to understand the different pieces of this really complex problem. And now, super quickly, to end in my last minute or so, so I leave time for questions, is I always like to end with a little bit of like a what can you do? Maybe you don't have power to change the way your municipality is monitoring biodiversity, but as an individual, if you're feeling like fired up about biodiversity now, you can learn, you can plant, and you can advocate. And so learning starts with observing the world around you. So like, do you know the names of your neighborhood creatures? Next time you're outside and you see something interesting, I'm gonna challenge you to stop and learn its name. I usually suggest people start with a tree, but it's the middle of winter and winter tree idea is quite challenging. So, maybe choose a bird. There's good apps out there. There's Merlin that can listen to bird song. Or, if you're a paper book person, find a guidebook. Just next time you see something, try and figure out what it is. And often that's the first step to, understanding something, which is the first step to protecting something. If you are lucky enough to have space, you have a yard, or you're, involved with managing a campus or a church. I know it doesn't seem like it right now with like the blizzard coming down outside, but it's garden season in just a few months. Spring is the best time to plant native species, to plant perennials. And so if you have space to plant, improve your own biodiversity. Consider native or wildlife friendly species, avoid invasive species. There are almost certainly resources in your area that will help you with this. And if you already know about biodiversity and you don't have space or don't have uh, a place to plant yourself, maybe you have time or you have money, and I hope that you all vote. And so you can support local organizations and initiatives. You can advocate for a more biodiversity, for an administration that prioritizes biodiversity. That could be through volunteering or writing op-eds or donating. And the great thing about this is you can do it from different positions. So, you work in the health field, work on making those connections between biodiversity and health, making your fellow health practitioners aware that this is important. You work in education, that's a great way to engage with biodiversity. Maybe you're just, you don't work in any of these fields, but you're a passionate citizen. Volunteer with an organization that's doing stewardship, for example. With that, I am going to end here so that I see lots of things popping up in the chat that I hope are questions for me, and I'll have some time to answer those now.
All right. Thank you, Carly, for this great presentation filled with interesting information. I'm gonna check right now the chat box. I apologize in advance if ever I don't pronounce the person's name correctly. I'll do my best. Brian McChatty, his question is, are birds retreating to the city due to the loss of forest around cities? They are in the city, but are they breeding successfully given the small areas as access and nest predation by crows, squirrel, etc.?
Yeah, this is a great question. In general, the birds we see in the city tend to be like a subset of the birds in the broader area. So we do tend to see less bird species in the city than we do surrounding them because, not all birds can survive the stressors of the city. In terms of that second part, are they breeding successfully? That is a great question, and a question that we have less research on than things like, how many species are they? In general, sometimes they're breeding successfully and sometimes they are not. And that can depend on things like, is your green space large enough to support those birds? I had a student recently do work on this area in Montreal where she was actually looking at nest success, so tracking how well individual nests did, and she was looking at whether trails or people using those spaces affected it, and they didn't, which was nice news for these spaces that we could share the space with our birds. But the nest success overall was still pretty low, and so there are likely other factors, like predation that you mentioned. Um, and so I think that's an area where we need to think about in our specific context in our city, where are the places where birds are breeding well and what can we do to support more of that?
Okay.
Cats also, keep your cats inside. Huge impact on urban birds.
Very interesting. Another question from Jonathan Kumaris. How does municipal planning work around biodiversity of parks, streetscape when it comes to plant tree selection? Is this already done well, or are there areas for policy changes to enhance biodiversity?
Yeah, so I think there's always room for improvement. I would say in general, this depends a lot on the municipality. So different municipalities are going to have different policies, also different amounts of capacity. Overall, I would say that this is something that has really improved in a lot of cities. We're paying much more attention now to planting a diversity of species, to not planting, monocultures of just one tree species that was often done in the past. Now, trees grow really slowly, so it's going to take time for this to come into effect. I think in general, a lot of areas are doing pretty well when it comes to trees and urban forestry management. I think there's a lot of room for improvement on how we manage other kinds of plants. So we still see tons of lawns that are just like, a couple of species. They're mostly grass. They're not particularly beneficial for biodiversity. And so I think if we can start shifting towards more like ground level biodiversity, more flowers that are going to support insects, that are going to, beautify our spaces, that's where we can make a lot of improvement. And that's an area where we really need to change people's perceptions because a lot of people see more kind of wild or natural spaces and they think, oh, that's messy. I don't like it. I'm going to call my city councilor and complain about it. And so the more that we can kind of get people used to the idea of like mowing the grass a little less, introducing a few more species, that would make a huge difference for biodiversity. The other area, and this is not necessarily a municipal decision, but if you go to a garden center, they are selling all kinds of invasive plants that we know are harmful, and you can go and buy them and put them on your garden. And I would love to see more regulations around like what nurseries are able to sell or not. And that pipeline is really complicated. I'm not sure how we make that happen, but if that would be a great area to work towards is supporting the removal of invasive plants from nurseries.
That's super interesting. Another question, Haley Goodchild. That seems like a big difference in the number of wild bee species observed between Toronto, she said 350, and
Mhm.
Montreal 170. What factors help explain the difference? Is it just a matter of scale or the urban green spaces?
Yeah, so the big difference is just climate. It's latitude. As we go further south and it gets warmer, a lot more species can persist. It's the same reason that if we go down to like southern Ontario where we have Carolinian forests, we get more tree species than as we come further north. And so even though it doesn't seem like a huge difference, think about, winter temperatures in Montreal compared to Toronto, or temperatures at other parts of the year. Also, I'm thinking of winter because it's snowing right now. They're different enough that you get a lot more species that are able to persist the further south that you go. So that's the main difference. There may be some small differences in terms of size of green spaces or the types of plant species that are available, but again, you get more plant species as you go further south and it's warmer as well. So more plant species supporting more bee species. It's mostly a climate thing.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of questions. So I might have to skip some, but there's the next one is from Danny Duaron. Carly, how should municipalities account for shifting ecosystem ranges under climate change when planning for urban greening and increasing biodiversity in their community?
Yeah, so I'm seeing someone has already commented a resource, which looks great. So this is something that a lot of municipalities are starting to, again, I'm more familiar with like urban forestry and tree planting, but municipalities are starting to think about, planting more species from like just south of their range. So, maybe Montreal starts planting species that you would more typically see in Toronto that do well there. So that they, as those trees grow up, 10, 20, 30, 100 years from now, when those trees are still here, they're adapted to the climate that we have. Now, this idea in general of kind of assisted migration can be really controversial in the ecological community. So some scientists will say, absolutely not. We should not be moving things around. We don't know what kinds of problems we could create in terms of invasive species. Others are saying, well, maybe we need to start doing this if we want to maintain species. So that's a little bit up for debate in the scientific community. But in general, even choosing species that are, still within your native range, but are more heat tolerant, more drought tolerant, like thinking of the traits those species will need given the climate 50 years from now and planting for that rather than planting for what you have right now.
Okay. Next question is from Jeff Brook. There seems to be a considerable potential interest in addressing the density greenness balance with green roofs. I note you just brought that up. Do you have more insight? What makes the biodiverse, successful green roof? Are there examples, urban areas that have done better at addressing the hurdles of more green roofs?
Yeah, great question. So what makes a biodiverse, successful green roof? So green roofs, I'm not an expert, but there are different types of green roofs, right? So we have like extensive green roofs that tend to have shallower substrate. A lot of plants like sedum often are more monoculture. Um, and then you can have intensive, like green roofs that have a little bit deeper substrate or soil that you can plant, native plants or even like food plants in some cases. I think the more we can move towards green roofs that can incorporate a diversity of plants and more native plants, that's going to do better in terms of biodiversity. It's likely also going to be a little bit better in terms of things like cooling as well, because those deeper rooted plants are going to transpire more. They're going to create more of an effect. So I think and again, monitoring, study, like see what these green roofs are putting in. Are they working? What are they doing? What species are visiting them? What do the temperatures look like? We see one of my colleagues who works in Toronto, who works a lot on green roofs, has been looking into the effects of the bylaw there. So Toronto has a municipal bylaw that for buildings of a certain size, you need a certain percentage of green roofs, which seems great. But what they have started seeing, he calls it like green roof CSI. They've started noticing that these green roofs appear and then they disappear a few years later. So people, corporations are rolling out a green roof, like, almost like a carpet to meet the bylaw. And then they're not maintaining it. They're getting rid of it because they've gotten their check mark. And so that's why we need, we need monitoring, we need evaluation, we need to check up on these regulations. And we need to keep advancing our understanding. So if we know certain green roofs are more successful than others, can we start shifting our regulations and our requirements to require those practices? Yeah, in general, what makes a biodiverse green roof? More diversity of plants, because that's going to scale up to more diversity of insects and birds and other things that can use that space.
Okay. I have like one last question.
Sure. Yep.
Sorry about the other participants. We'll take into account your questions later on. Shannon Logan, I'm curious what Carly's take is on mini forests as a biodiversity solution.
Yeah, great question. So mini forests are like really having a moment right now. Everyone wants to plant a mini forest. My take is that they are probably, a net good, particularly if you're replacing like a lawn. Like if you're going from just lawn and you're putting a mini forest in, I like that they promote native species. I like that they often promote, community engagement. What we don't know a lot about yet are the longer term impacts of these mini forests. And we call a lot of things mini forests. So they don't always follow the same, like some are following that Miyawaki method and are really precise, and some are just trees in a small space. But I think in general, what we need is more research following these mini forests to know, okay, how many of these trees survive? Some of them, you're planting them really dense, some are going to die, which is okay. But which ones are surviving? What are the actual benefits we're getting? Um, Trying, doing experiments where we have mini forests that have been planted and managed differently and seeing what's the best way to do this for our ecosystem, for the cities that we're planting them in. And so I think if you've got a space that's just going to be, grass or low biodiversity, and you can shift that to a mini forest, you're likely getting benefits. The magnitude of those benefits, and if they're better than other solutions, we still need more research to like really be sure. So they're not like a silver bullet. I think people always want to find like the one thing that is going to solve all of our climate and biodiversity problems. And right now it's mini forests. And it's not going to solve all our problems, but it might solve some of them.
Super. Thank you so much. That's all the time we have. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for your time, Carly, and also everyone that has joined on us on today's webinar. And I will also want to say stay tuned for other Canoes events, which will be advertised in our newsletter and our LinkedIn page. If you're not yet registered to our mailing list or don't follow us on LinkedIn yet, please do so. And I want to wish everyone a good day and thank you so much.